I have the great pleasure of hosting Professor Richard Hrvoje. So, Professor Hrvoje, thank you so much for your time and for doing this podcast.
Well, I'm happy to do it. Always like to talk about intelligence research.
Excellent. Okay, so I would like to start our discussion on intelligence with the first question. So you have spent a couple of decades studying the biological basis of intelligence. So how has your understanding of neural underpinnings of intelligence changed since you first started?
Well, it's more than a couple of decades. When I started in graduate school around the early 1970s,
Okay.
there were some very basic questions about intelligence and individual differences. For example, one of the big questions was whether genes had anything to do with intelligence or not. And today, of course, we not only know that genes strongly influence individual differences in intelligence, but specific genes are being identified that have some effect, and the complexity of the genetic effect on intelligence has turned out to be daunting. So that's one change. Another change is that the only way to look at brain relationships to intelligence essentially was with EEG. And by today's standards, the EEG in the 1970s was pretty rudimentary, and you had to make inferences about what was happening in the brain from scalp recordings. Now we have neuroimaging with positron emission tomography, with functional MRI, with structural MRI, with diffusion tensor imaging, and even more sophisticated brain imaging, showing what is happening in the brain while people are solving problems on an intelligence test, for example. And the mapping of structural connections and functional connections, individual by individual, has demonstrated that both the functional and structural connectivity of the brain is related to individual differences in intelligence. And you can actually make a reasonable prediction of a person's IQ score from their brain image. This is remarkable, really, when you go back to the pioneers of intelligence research and what they thought might be possible. We're really living in an extraordinary research time to understand what the brain is doing to make people intelligent. But having said that, we hardly know anything. It's a vast, complicated series of cascading events in the brain, from synaptic level, to neurotransmitter level, to brain circuitry, to finally to behavior. And the interactions among all these influences are extraordinarily complex. So it's a real challenge for researchers, just like in all other branches of science. The more you know and the better your measurement, the more questions you have. And the fuzzier things look sometimes, not clearer. And so that's where we are.
Right. And in your book, The Neuroscience of Intelligence, which I highly recommend to our viewers, you argue that the intelligence is largely biological, actually. Could you explain how this perspective or challenges or aligns with popular beliefs about intelligence?
Well, if you believe that there are environmental influences on intelligence, and there may be, the question is, how do those influences affect the brain? Because between any environmental influences and intelligent behavior, somehow those environmental influences have to affect the behavior through the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And that process is inherently a biological process, whether it's genetic or not. And what most researchers believe is that genes are heavily involved in individual differences in intelligence, and at least some of those genes, and there could be hundreds, if not 1,000 genes, each with tiny effects.
Mm-hmm.
And moreover, many of those genes may be sensitive to environmental variables, general variables like stress in the environment,
Mm-hmm.
or genes turn on and off over the lifespan. So what triggers genes turning on and off could well have something to do with environmental stimuli,
Yeah.
specific or general. We're at a stage where many people believe those interactions between environment and even culture
Mm-hmm.
and genetic influences are so complex that it could never be understood.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have
I
a
see.
different view because I'm not a geneticist, and because I am completely naive as to the actual difficulties involved.
Mm-hmm.
I look at the history of science, which is the history of solving very complex problems. And
Right.
the brain, how the brain works is complex, but every year there are fantastic advances in the methodologies and technologies to look at the brain, right from the
Mm-hmm.
synapse on up. And so I don't know when, but if you take a long time scale view of research programs, I believe sooner or later we will understand how all the influences work together to explain individual differences in intelligence. And
Mm-hmm.
that is important because once we have at least some understanding of this cascade of events in the brain, then we might be able to manipulate those mechanisms
Right.
in a way that would increase intelligence, maybe even dramatically, for individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And this really, I think, is the holy grail of intelligence research.
Mm-hmm. I see. And what do you think? What are the implications of finding that environmental influences on intelligence decreases with age while genetic influences increase?
Well, the fact that the genetic influences appear to increase with age and the environmental effects, whatever they are, appear to
Mm-hmm.
decrease with age just emphasizes the importance of the underlying biology and de-emphasizes the importance of whatever the environmental influences are. And
Mm-hmm.
I have to add, we don't really know what the environmental influences are. And I
Right.
think, ironically, we can only study that once we have a good handle on what genes are involved.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can do studies to find how those genes are influenced by outside stimuli or by other genes. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is going to be a very complex undertaking. But there are many people around the world working on trying to understand what genes do, what genes produce, what the gene products are, and how those products
Mm-hmm.
affect things in the brain. So, over the long haul, I'm optimistic. But one of the implications is that you might be able to take people with very low intellectual ability
Mm-hmm.
and increase it. So if somebody has an IQ of 80 and you can make it 90, you
Mm-hmm.
have changed that person's life for the
Right.
good. If you
Right.
and depending on what we learn about the mechanisms, it may be possible to take somebody with an IQ of 130, which is two
Mm-hmm.
standard deviations above the mean, and boost it to 145, three standard deviations above the mean.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this would be extraordinary at each point in the normal distribution of intelligence to be able to shift things toward more intelligence rather than less. I think there are implications for education. There are implications even for the economy, because most modern economies are driven by innovation, and much of that innovation comes from a STEM, which requires higher intellectual ability. So in some ways, small countries are at a disadvantage because they don't have that many people at the high end.
Mm-hmm.
Bigger countries like India and China have many more people at the high end. There are all kinds of implications ranging from the way an individual lives their life and maximizes their ability, all the way up to how nations compete in the modern world.
So how do you address ethical concerns and how this research could be misused?
Well, let's start with the idea that if we knew how to increase intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
I would argue we have a moral obligation to do so. Imagine that there was a pill to increase IQ. Wouldn't we want everyone to have it? And by pill, I mean that metaphorically, whatever turns out to be able to increase IQ, even
Mm-hmm.
if you can change someone's environment or change someone's culture. Then you
Right.
have questions about, is it morally right to want to change someone's culture to increase their IQ? Is it the
Mm-hmm.
same moral question as a biological approach to changing someone's IQ? There are all kinds of issues here, but as long as people have a free choice and people understand what's available and what any side effects might be and so on, then
Mm-hmm.
it's open for debate. But I think I make the assumption that more intelligence is better than less. If
I see.
anyone wants to argue the opposite, they're free to do so.
Right. You're
Um,
100% correct.
but
Yeah.
but there are many ethical questions about availability. Who could afford this? Should it be for free? Should it be available to everyone?
Mm-hmm.
If other kids in school are taking cognitive enhancements, should you allow your kids to take cognitive enhancements? Is cognitive enhancement cheating in some sense, like
Mm-hmm.
drug enhancement in sports? Lots of issues. The controversies about whether genes affect intelligence or not are pretty much over.
Right.
Virtually everybody understands that genes have some influence on individuals. It remains controversial as to whether genes play any role in average group differences
Mm-hmm.
uh, among populations. That's a very contentious issue. There are data emerging that will help resolve this issue. And in my experience, most people are looking forward to seeing the data and understanding what the data mean and what the data don't mean,
Mm-hmm.
and going on from there, just like in all branches of science.
Right. And what would you say? How has our understanding of intelligence evolved with the advancement of neuroscience techniques like brain imaging? And would you say that there are some challenges in predicting intelligence from brain imaging images?
Well, what's evolved is the most common criticism from people who don't know the field is that we don't know what intelligence is, and we
Mm-hmm.
don't have any good way to measure it. They think IQ tests are biased or meaningless. But from the
Mm-hmm.
first brain imaging study that we did back in 1988, where we showed correlations between measurable brain characteristics using imaging with positron emission tomography
Mm-hmm.
and uh, intelligence test scores, it became clear that these scores had some brain meaning.
Right.
And uh, the way we define intelligence for research is mostly by the common aspect of reasoning. It's really the aspect of reasoning that's common to all tests of mental ability. It's called the G factor for general intelligence. And the estimating the G factor is done very nicely by IQ tests, standard IQ tests, because they sample at least 6 to 12 different mental ability domains. And the G factor emerges irrespective of the content of the test. It's a latent variable. It can't be measured directly, but it can be estimated. And IQ tests are a good estimate. Matrix reasoning tests are a good estimate of G. And G by itself accounts for roughly half of the variance among people. It doesn't account for all of the variance, but it accounts for the biggest single amount. And that's why most brain imaging research on intelligence and most genetic research on intelligence focuses on some measure of the G factor. It has nothing to do with wisdom or creativity. Those are all other aspects with their own measurement issues.
Okay, and what are the key differences between psychometric and chronometric testing of intelligence?
Well, chronometric testing refers to using reaction time to measure brain processing speed. And measures of brain processing speed turn out to be correlated moderately with paper and pencil or the psychometric tests of intelligence.
Right.
And when you show somebody a light and tell them to press a button when the light comes on, that's a simple reaction time. But if you have multiple lights with different instructions and make the choice more complex, the reaction time to a complex task actually is highly correlated with psychometric test scores of intelligence. So it links brain processing, chronometrics links brain processing to psychometric intelligence tests or the G factor. There are a lot of measurement issues here, and reaction time has not been developed sufficiently to be a great predictor of IQ, but it's a reasonable predictor of IQ.
Right. And how does the concept of brain efficiency relate to intelligence, and what evidence support or challenges this relationship?
Well, we did the very first brain imaging study of intelligence in 1988. And we use positron emission tomography, which is a technique that looks at brain function. And we were able to correlate brain function, brain activity in different brain areas while people were doing a test of the G factor. And we wanted to see in 1988 what would happen, because nobody had ever done this before with this kind of imaging. Positron emission tomography predated magnetic resonance imaging by about a dozen years. Okay? So this was very new, and we didn't quite know what to expect, but we wanted to see what areas of the brain lit up, so to speak, were more active while people were solving reasoning problems, very hard reasoning problems. And we did find some areas. But the absolute surprise was the more activity we saw in these areas, the less well people did on the IQ test. And we interpreted this as it wasn't how hard your brain was working that was related to being intelligent, but rather how efficiently your brain was working. And so this led to what is now called the brain efficiency hypothesis of intelligence. And in 1988, the study that we published on this got a lot of attention, and it had a sample size of 8 people.
I see.
8, not 80, 8.
Yeah.
And because this was so new and so expensive, but people were fascinated by this. And of course, nowadays, brain imaging studies have thousands of people. There are multinational consortiums that pool data. And so by today's standards, a sample size of 8 borders on ludicrous.
I see.
But there have now been many, many, many studies of brain efficiency. And as you mentioned, my book, I summarize all the research. It's a little inconsistent, but in general, it does look like there is evidence for the idea that smart brains are efficient brains. Now, how brains get to be efficient, that's another whole story. That's not so.
And what would you say are the implications of finding that not all brains work the same way even when achieving similar results on intelligence tests?
Well, it's very interesting that for decades, cognitive psychology did experiments where individual differences among the subjects were regarded as noise. And they chose to study cognitive tasks that minimized errors and minimized individual differences because they were looking for the general laws of cognitive behavior. It turns out not all brains work the same, and individual differences are really a key to understanding cognition. So imagine when functional MRIs started to be available to cognitive psychologists a little more than 2 decades ago. They were astounded when they looked at the brain images and saw how different brains were, and even more astounded when you could correlate those differences with differences in the cognitive behavior of subjects. So they became, slowly but surely, advocates of individual differences research.
I see. And how has the discovery of brain networks changed our understanding of intelligence compared to earlier theories about specific brain regions?
Well, for decades, based on brain injury, many neuropsychologists thought that intelligence was a function of the frontal lobes. And there were some reasonable observations that indicated that. But with brain imaging, it became apparent from our very first study that other areas of the brain were also involved. And that meant the connections among those brain areas had to be involved. And that's what led away from the idea that there was an intelligence area in the brain, or that this lobe or that lobe. We now are much more fine-grained about brain areas, getting down to millimeters, not lobes. And the connections among brain areas have been studied extensively over the last decade. And it turns out these connections, aspects of these connections that you can measure are related to individual differences. And some of the individual differences are so stable that they've been compared to fingerprints. Some people actually call these networks brain fingerprints for individuals. Neuropsychologists inferred from their observation of brain damaged patients that intelligence probably was seated in the frontal lobes. And for many years, there was an assumption that intelligence was a function of the frontal lobes. But with the very first brain imaging studies that we did, and now many, many other studies, it's very clear that many areas of the brain are coordinated for intelligent behavior. And so intelligence is no longer regarded just as a function of the frontal lobe, but more of a network approach And there's something called network neuroscience that is trying to understand how brain areas are connected to each other and how individual differences in those connections relate to intelligence. Some of the connectivity differences for individuals are so stable within those individuals that they're likened to fingerprints, that you can identify a person by the nature of his brain connectivity. And it turns out these differences in connectivity predict individual differences in psychometric test scores of intelligence. So it's a very exciting prospect to go from a level of explanation of intelligence from brain lobes, very large areas of the brain, down to millimeters of brain areas and the networks that connect them, both functional networks and structural networks. It's really a fascinating scientific advance, and people who work in this area are really excited about what they're able to see. We are so far beyond the old controversies of, does the brain have anything to do with it? Does intelligence have anything to do with it? Isn't it all just environmental or all culture? We are light years beyond that, trying to understand exactly what goes on in the brain, and it's very exciting research.
Right. And what are the ethical considerations around potentially enhancing intelligence through neuroscience developments?
Well, I don't know that the ethical challenges for enhancing intelligence using neuroscience are any different from the ethical questions surrounding intelligence, surrounding increase in intelligence by any other means.
I see.
If you could manipulate your environment to increase your IQ, how is that different from manipulating your biology?
Right.
These are not simple questions. It's, to me, they raise complex issues that need public discussion.
Yes, I agree with you. And how do savant abilities inform our understanding of general intelligence?
Well, savants are very interesting and unusual cases. Many savants have extraordinary specific mental abilities, apparently with no G factor at all.
Right.
So many savants, can be very good at one specific mental ability and virtually unable to care for themselves, or to be employed, or anything that requires some level of G. And when you see savants, in my mind, it raises two questions. How do they do it? And why can't I do it?
I see.
And the answer to both those questions is still mysterious. But they present a challenge for understanding the neural basis of intelligence, because it's extremely unlikely that their abilities and their lack of G have anything to do with their environment or their culture.
Right. And what would you say, what role does working memory play in intelligence, and how do researchers study this relationship?
Well, working memory is a very a strong component of the G factor. And it turns out that in some studies, the correlation between working memory ability and the G factor is so strong that some researchers think they're the same thing.
I see.
This is not settled completely, but it emphasizes that working memory is a really critical component of general intelligence.
And would you say that we should consider male and female subjects separately in intelligence research?
There are a large number of studies of brain imaging that show the areas and networks and connections of the brain related to intelligence may be different between men and women.
See.
And that's true when the men and women are matched for IQ. This suggests that the brain has more than one way to be intelligent. And this is still an area of study, but it derives from the idea that not all brains work the same way.
Right. And what is the significance of Parieto-frontal integration theory for understanding intelligence?
So the parietal-frontal integration theory of intelligence is something that my colleague Rex Jung and I proposed back in 2007, based on a review of all the brain imaging studies of intelligence up to that time. And what we were looking for were the brain areas that appeared most often in these studies. Often these studies had different sample sizes, they had different measures of intelligence, they had different neuroimaging techniques, but we were looking for the brain areas that kept coming up as related to intelligence. And the brain areas mostly were in the parietal lobes here on the side and the frontal lobes. And so we propose that the integration of information from the parietal to the frontal lobes and back again with some ancillary areas was the neural basis of intelligence. And since 2007, there have been many, many studies of the parietal-frontal integration theory, which we call the PFIT. And there's quite a bit of evidence supporting the idea that this parietal-frontal network is critical for understanding the biological basis of intelligence. And since we proposed it, there's now even more sophisticated imaging techniques that can look at the white matter fibers that actually connect these areas. And other techniques that can look at neuron characteristics. And so it was a way at the time to propose a testable set of hypotheses. And many people now have run tests of this. And of course, like all good theories, what's been generated are even more questions and a more sophisticated model of how the brain is related to intelligence.
Right. And with artificial intelligence development accelerating, many people are wondering how human intelligence will measure up against artificial systems. So how do you think our understanding of human intelligence could or should influence AI research?
About 20 years ago, I gave a talk to a group of AI developers. And the theme of my talk was the G factor in human intelligence and how that would influence artificial intelligence. And 20 years ago, I don't think I made much of an impact with this argument. But now, of course, so many people are interested in general artificial intelligence.
Yes.
And that seems to be the key. A way to emulate this general factor that human beings have that goes beyond the programming of specific abilities. I don't know enough about artificial intelligence to judge how far along the development of general artificial intelligence really is. I'm to the point now where I read papers about this, and I read brain imaging papers that I used to know a lot about. And now they are so technically different and so technically complex beyond my experience that I really can't judge them anymore. I can't act as a reviewer on scientific papers in this area
Hmm. I
because
see.
the younger generation, actually probably two younger generations since I was doing this, is so much more sophisticated and so much better trained on neuroscience uh,
Hmm.
that it is actually a pleasure for me to sit back and watch these developments from a distance. When I wrote The Neuroscience of Intelligence, I was able to read and summarize most of the papers to that time.
Hmm.
If I had to write yet another edition, I would be very hard pressed. While I can understand the results, summarizing the techniques and some of the intricacies of how they work is
Hmm.
really now beyond me. And I think this might be true for many people in different areas of science as they get older. But it is a pleasure to see the progress from where the field was when I started.
I see. And do you think that people should be afraid of artificial general intelligence?
Well, people should be more afraid of real intelligence.
I see.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
real and very intelligent people have done a lot of damage
Mhm.
historically, and so have very unintelligent people. So I don't know that the artificial world is going to be much different.
I see. Okay, and what is the relationship between creativity and intelligence from a neuroscience perspective?
Well, there have been a lot of studies trying to look at the brain correlates of creativity.
Hmm.
And for people who think it's difficult to measure intelligence, let me just say that measuring creativity is much more difficult.
I see.
And I've done some of this work with the colleague I mentioned before, Rex Young, who has an expertise in creativity research. And we were looking for brain areas that were related to both intelligence and creativity. And there are
Hmm.
now many, many studies of this. It turns out um, that in general, brain disinhibition seems to be related to creativity, especially in some of the areas related to intelligence. You know, the
Hmm.
brain works in a balance between excitation and inhibition. And it seems that disinhibited brains, at least disinhibited to some small degree,
Hmm.
might foster creativity. But this is an area that I'm really not sure about.
Right. And how does the brain development during childhood relate to intelligence afterwards?
Well, there are now many, many very good studies of brain development looking at the same individual over time, looking at groups at different ages over time.
Hmm.
And there are now maps of the brain that show how the brain areas develop over time. And
Hmm.
some of those developmental curves seem to be related to individual differences in intelligence. What drives those individual differences is thought to be largely genetic, but probably in interaction with non-genetic variables. Uh,
Hmm.
Again, it's an area that is progressing. I'm not sure I'm completely up to the speed on what the findings are,
Hmm.
but those are the issue of how brains develop over time and how it relates to intelligence. These are finite questions that can be studied now.
I
And
see.
getting the answers is not so easy. And
Hmm.
um, in the book you mentioned, I talk about three laws.
Hmm.
The first law is that no story about the brain is simple,
Yeah.
and the second law is that no one study is definitive. And the third law is it takes many years and many studies to work out what the weight of evidence really is. And
Hmm.
that's where we are on many of these issues. Takes
Right.
time.
Yes, and what implications do your findings have for how we design our education systems?
Well, that is a controversial question.
Mm-hmm.
My opinion is that although there are many claims of improving educational approaches with neuroscience approaches,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure we know enough about the neuroscience of learning and memory to translate into specific educational strategies yet.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, maybe we do, but so far, there's some superficial things. Um, and cognitive psychology found some techniques about testing periodically that seems to help people, students learn. But
Mm-hmm.
whether we know anything from neuroscience yet is not so clear to me.
I see. And what would you say? How do brain efficiency patterns differ from between experts and beginners in a specific cognitive task?
Well, we studied this back in around 1990. We
Mm-hmm.
asked the question, how does the brain get efficient? Is this what happens when you learn something?
Mm-hmm.
So when you imagine the first time you learned to drive a car, do you remember you were thinking about steering the wheel and taking your foot off the gas, putting it on the brake? It would have been hard on that first day to carry on a conversation with the person next to you about current events because you
Right.
were totally focused. Now, when you drive, you do think many other things. You can talk to people. The driving has become somewhat unconscious. And the question is your brain now more efficient driving? And to
Mm-hmm.
address this question, we got a computer game that was brand new at the time that nobody had ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
It literally was just arriving in stores, and it was called Tetris.
Yes.
And we bought a copy of Tetris, and we scanned people the first time they played Tetris with positron emission tomography.
Mm-hmm.
And then they practiced every day for about 50 or 60 days.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to come to my office to practice because at this time, virtually nobody had a computer at home.
Yeah.
And, Tetris was on a floppy disk drive, and this is like 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And we then scanned them after all this practice when they became very good at Tetris. Uh, Tetris is a game that the better you do, the faster it goes.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of 50 days of practice, these students were operating so fast that you
Mm-hmm.
could scarcely believe a human being could do this. And
I
we
see.
scanned them at that new level of proficiency. And the hypothesis was on that second scan, they would show less brain activity, not
Uh-huh.
more. And
Right.
that's what we found. And that
Right.
study, by the way, has become a cult classic. It's actually
Mm-hmm.
in the Guinness Book of Records for gaming as the first study of showing a computer game affected the brain.
Mm-hmm. Right. And what role does the white matter play in intelligence, and how do we study it?
Well, white matter, there are imaging techniques using MRI to study white matter. The most
Mm-hmm.
common one is called diffusion tensor imaging, and that looks at the integrity of white matter. And you
Mm-hmm.
can actually map out white matter tracks and
Mm-hmm.
correlate measurements of that white matter with things like IQ scores. And
Mm-hmm.
it turns out that white matter seems to be important in the relationship between intelligence and the brain because white matter is what connects brain areas to each other. So
Yes.
white matter and gray matter are both important.
Mm-hmm. And how might the concept of neuro-poverty influence social policy discussions?
Um, as far as I know, most social policy discussions do not include any mention of neuroscience,
Hmm.
and usually there's no mention of intelligence and differences among people in intelligence. Seems like this annoys people to even have the conversation.
Hmm.
But of course, intelligence is what drives success in academia. It
Hmm.
drives success in many vocations. It's a critically important topic in psychology, but it still seems to upset people to talk about it. Not
Yes.
everybody, by the way. When I give public talks, they're very well received, and public
Hmm.
really wants to know more about this. In academia, not so much.
I see. And given what we know about intelligence, do you see a future where we can enhance cognitive abilities through interventions like brain stimulation or drugs? And if yes, what are the risks and opportunities there?
I do think that is in the future, but we don't know enough yet to assess the risks. The
Hmm.
risks, there will be many questions about, if it should be done, who can do it, when it should be done. Uh, but I believe that once we understand the neuroscience of intelligence, we will be able to manipulate the relevant mechanisms and
Hmm.
increase intelligence, perhaps dramatically.
What originally drew you to study intelligence?
Well, when I was in graduate school, I started graduate school in 1971 at Johns Hopkins University.
Hmm.
And that was the year a professor named Julian Stanley began a project called the Study of Mathematically and Scientifically Precocious Kids.
Right.
And he went around to middle school mathematics teachers
Hmm.
and asked them to nominate the best students they had in mathematics
Okay.
for a special testing session where he gave the SAT math test, the real SAT math, to
Hmm.
these 11, 12, and 13-year-old kids. And surprisingly, he found many of these kids were scoring as high as Hopkins freshmen at the time.
Wow.
And this began the study of, uh, of how to accelerate education for these kids who are so good
Hmm.
beyond their age mates. And there have been many books and papers written about this study. But because I was there when it began, I got very interested in how these kids got to be so good at mathematical reasoning ability.
Hmm.
And that really is the origin of my interest in intelligence and general ability.
Hmm.
But it really started with that study.
Wonderful. And what do you think will be the biggest breakthroughs in intelligence research over the next decade?
Well, I'm sure there will be some combination of genetic and neuroscience and neuroimaging, that
Hmm.
all of that will somehow come together, and the interactions among genes with other genes and other environmental variables will be explicated. And we'll really start to understand this on a much more fundamental level. I think 10 years is a very long time given the
Hmm.
quick pace of research now. So, I don't even want to predict. It could be very dramatic.
Right. And what are some of the most persistent misconceptions about intelligence that you wish people understand a bit better?
Well, intelligence can be measured for scientific investigation. It's not an unknowable concept.
Hmm.
It is something that is real, it exists, and it is fundamental to individual lives.
Hmm.
And it is not beyond science's capability to investigate it empirically and understand it in a way that can benefit individuals and maybe even society as a whole.
I see. And my final question, so for people interested in boosting their own intellectual capabilities, what would you suggest based on your research? Are there any habits or practices that actually work?
I get that. I get that question a lot, and my answer is, if I knew of any, I would be doing them.
Yes, right.
And so I
So
don't. There's a lot of talk about different vitamins or different nootropic drugs or different diets, and even some drugs. As
mhm,
far as I know, none of it is going to increase the G factor.
I see. So is there anything else you would like to add for our viewers at the end?
Only that this is a very exciting field. So for
Mhm.
young people interested in the brain and looking for something to study that would really, over the next decade or two, be extremely important, um, instead of looking at learning and memory, which are
Mhm.
fundamental parts of intelligence, go up a step and start studying intelligence. I think you will find it a very rewarding field of study.
Professor Heyer, this was an absolutely delightful conversation. So I would like to thank you very much for your time.
Well, I'm happy to do it, and I'll look forward to seeing the comments when you post this.
Of course. Thank you once again.
All right, thank you. Take care.
Take care.